Thank you, and welcome. Today we're going to be talking about testing with Codeception. Who in the room is familiar with test-driven development using PHP unit or something like that? PHP test, PHP-T or that sort of thing. BDD, anybody done BDD before? Much less, okay. Just trying to gauge as an audience where you're at. Okay, this is me. I'm the Managing Director of Magma Digital, based in the northwest of the UK, founder of the PHP Northwest User Group and Conference, which is in about 3 weeks' time. If you haven't bought a ticket, it's a very good conference. About 400 people will be there. I'm also involved in a trade association in the northwest of UK to do with digital and creative sector. Now, is Stefan in the room? No, it's Stefan's fault, is this? This is not my name, okay? This started at DPC through a genuine mistake. However, at this conference, it was a genuine, deliberate effort and not a mistake. So, Scoop's on my hit list now. Okay, so after all of that, let's look at Codeception. So Codeception is a fairly new testing framework. It's quite powerful. It allows you to test in all the ways you might expect and some that you might not. It's built on top of Symfony 2 components, so it's kind of got a relatively stable set of platforms it's built on top of, including PHP unit. And for those of you who might be familiar with the BHAT framework for BDD testing, it uses the Mink drivers from there to actually control browsers and things. I'll just let you read the statement there from Codeception's own website. It's a BDD-style PHP testing framework. And the last sentence is probably the one I'd want to major on, is that it's kept as simple as possible for any kind of users. Now, at our company, we have an apprentice who started about a year ago, age 16, and he had done no formal computer training. He was a user, if you will, rather than a developer. Didn't know what a variable was when he started. And within 3 months of immersion in a full PHP development shop, he was able to write tests. Okay, so from not knowing a variable to being able to test things using this framework. So let's get on to the pitch. Codeception is fairly straightforward and easy to read, write, and debug. And basically, it allows a common framework to be shared between maybe testers, developers, analysts, business stakeholders, etc. The more deeply you get into it, the less readable it might be by humans. However, they'll be able to follow the basic gist of it. And as you can see from the slide on the right here, it's quite readable. I'm a new web guy and I've got a scenario. I want to create a wiki page. I am on page /. I click pages, I click new, I see new page. It really is taken from the kind of user's perspective of what you're doing. So your code metaphors, as you're beginning testing, are very simple. It's only an arrow between the I and the action that makes it non-English. The rest of it's pretty English. You know, most people get that within a few moments, including analysts, business owners, yeah? So it kind of takes it away from the domain of just being developers able to actually write the test. Now, I know BHAT kind of does the same as well as a framework, writes in English, and we'll show how Codeception tackles that in a little while. But I can give somebody an IDE and it's got code completion and they can be writing this stuff in a few minutes. For me, who always, I mean, I've been doing web development now for about 15 years. Testing kind of started and grew up during my time as a developer. And it's something that, with some of the tools, I find it quite hard to just get started. You know, you need quite a bit of code to actually just start testing. It's very hard for new people to the industry to kind of get their head around, and it really is, you need your uber geek hat on that day to be able to kind of do it. For some people, it's just second nature, but for me, I always struggled. So I want something that makes testing fun, and I hope I'll show that in a little while. So what does Codeception actually do? Well, unit tests. Why would I need that compared with PHP unit? Well, it's unit tests but with a few bells and whistles. It does functional tests, which is more testing out your frameworks than units. Acceptance tests, actually testing at the browser level, and also API tests and things like that. And one of its key features is that it can repopulate your database as it starts the tests. So it can tear down your database and recreate it. In the remainder of this talk, we're actually going to focus on the acceptance, functional, and DB layers of testing rather than the unit level. So, onto some features then for Codeception. It has multiple backends that can easily be swapped out and changed just with a very basic YAML configuration file. So Selenium, Selenium 2, PHP browser, which is just a kind of PHP implementation of a browser using curl. Zombie.js for a headless JavaScript browser, same for Phantom.js, and several more. One of the things that makes it... who's used Selenium as a tool? Okay. One of the things you might find if you've used Selenium to drive around a web page is that it can be quite brittle. If things move in your DOM, you move things around, Selenium tends to break because the XPath notation is quite brittle. So Codeception allows you to find things by name, almost like a human might. CSS selectors and those sort of things. So it actually makes it relatively straightforward. I've already mentioned about cleaning up data after each time you run. And I probably would think your favourite frameworks are on screen there. And there's probably others if it's not already there. And continuous integration is usually a key part of people's kind of testing approaches, and there's no exception with Codeception. So some more features then, if there weren't enough already. It actually uses PHP unit. It can take existing PHP unit tests exactly as they are and run them within the framework. So if you've already got tests, great. You can integrate them into this framework and then start adding additional features on top of them. We mentioned BDD, behavior-driven development, which are kind of scenario-based tests, often for business owners or stakeholders to be able to write acceptance criteria. So, for example, it will be given this scenario, when this happens, I expect to see this output. That's the kind of classical way of describing behavior. And you can do similar things in Codeception. There's also modules that help test REST, SOAP, XML, RPC, etc. Various output formats, and also simple fixtures. Fixtures are basically known sets of data, so you can have pre-known values to enable testing against that. ORM helper layers, and also code coverage. All the things you might expect out of a testing framework. The one extra thing worth a slight mention is remote code coverage, even for browsing around a website. We're not going to demo that today because it's pretty difficult to set up and demo on stage, but basically it allows you to test a website and through Xdebug's remote protocol pick up the code coverage from inside. So if you're trying to get 100% code coverage, you don't actually need to do it with unit tests anymore. Okay, on screen are some examples in the bottom right-hand corner of the current module set that's available within Codeception. And modules essentially just extend the connectivity and features within Codeception and basically give you additional actions or methods. And this is well contributed to as an open source project. It's all on GitHub. Most of the modules are created by community members. The guy who writes the kind of core framework hasn't written most of the modules. He's written a few, but then other people have written the modules. And for example, Zen Frameworks 2's integration, the actual module is less than 400 lines of PHP to integrate that. So they're very simple to write as well. So what do you need to know in order to be familiar with Codeception? As we mentioned, it's on Symfony 2 components, PHP unit and BHAT elements for the wire protocol, so it can talk to things like Selenium. It's MIT licensed, which is usually fairly acceptable by most people. PHP 5.3 and curl are pretty much the only dependencies. It's written by Michael Bodnarchuk, who is in the Ukraine, and since about June it's sponsored as a project by the guys behind the Yi framework, two amigos. Okay, we're just going to now look at some of the differences between the layers in Codeception. You've got three core layers. You've got the acceptance layer, functional layer, and unit layers. The acceptance layer is basically browser emulation. You're driving a real browser. It looks like it's going around in a browser. You can see things being clicked. Okay? It's very good to show clients. When you say, right, we're going to write some automated tests, and they haven't a clue what that really means, you can actually show them, or even video it, screencast it, and say, here's the tests running. And now here's the tests running really fast. That's why we do it, instead of doing it by hand, we do it driven by automation. You can test any website. If it's publicly available or on your network, you can test anything. You can test JavaScript and Ajax, the full kind of experience. The code, in terms of Codeception, is actually still readable by humans or managers, for want of a better term. And it's relatively stable against changes in your code, because it's the output of the code that's being tested. There is a small danger for some false positives. For example, when you're testing things in a browser, it can go at lightning speed, faster than you would as a human, clicking things. And sometimes if you're waiting for things like Ajax responses, you need to put a wait state in to allow the Ajax return to happen. So most of the tests that I run with kind of a 300 millisecond delay, just to allow for, responsiveness and things like that. It does run quite slowly because it's actually launching a browser. It's actually drawing the windows. It's actually drawing all the elements on screen. If the DOM needs manipulating and drawing, it all happens for real. So it's as slow as the normal browsing experience is. If we then move on to look at functional level testing, this is done without a web server. This emulates web requests, so it actually will fire up your framework, it will send a request and get the results and put assertions against the returned results. So it submits to your application and gets things back, but it doesn't require Apache or Nginx or whatever. So it can query internal values of your framework because it's actually got an instance of your framework available, so you can get properties and things out. And it's still mostly readable by humans, but the limitation is because it's not a real web server, you have to emulate JavaScript and Ajax requests. You can't actually make them for real. Again, some risk of false positives. And we'd say that this is perhaps less slow than unit level testing. And so obviously, onto the cheetah now, which is the fast version, is unit tests. Unit tests run as quick as anything because you're testing a very small amount of code. But in terms of Codeception, it's actually unit tests on top of PHP unit with some of the niceties that come along with Codeception, so you can make your tests look more friendly. It kind of makes it more readable for PHP unit, in my experience. However, this is probably not readable by managers. You actually need to be a developer to understand what's going on inside those. But it is proper unit testing, it's isolated units. So you would use mocking out other services you might be relying on, so you'd mock elements out and that sort of thing. So, Codeception then, how do you actually use it? We're going to do a live demo in a little moment, and so you'll get to see a lot of these things in action. But basically, you run the Codeception binary. It's a FAR file, actually, mostly, and it will bootstrap, and that sets up a test folder, creates a codeception.yaml file, and just creates the structure around your project. You then go ahead and configure which modules you want to use in your tests, setting up which layer you want to test at, be it acceptance, functional, or unit level testing. And then an important step which catches out people with Codeception when they first use it is every time you change a config and add a new module or take one away, you need to reissue the build step. And that basically creates copies of the kind of internal elements of Codeception, puts them in the folders where you'll be writing your tests to enable your IDE to do code completion. So it's very important that that's done. Also, if you're trying to use an action that doesn't exist in that copy, it won't run the tests properly, you'll get an error. So build is quite important. And then the next few items on there, the generate sept, generate test, generate unit, and generate scenarios, they actually create stubbed classes for you to actually work against. Files mostly, actually, not classes. So a lot of things can be generated, auto-generated by the framework for you. However, you do still have to write your own tests. That's where you perhaps have to put your most effort. After you've written your tests, you then go ahead and run. Now, run is something we'll see a lot of in the demo, but there's a number of flags you can pass. Steps allows you to see every step that's happening in every test. So if you're running a whole set of tests in one go, normally it will only show the output from the end of each test, either OK or fail. However, if you pass the steps flag, it'll show every step in every test as it runs a whole set of tests. Debug, exactly as it says. Silent suppresses most output. And then you can have report, which is often used for your continuous integration environments, and various output formats for that. XML is probably the one you'd use for a lot of continuous integration environments. And then after that, you specify optionally which suite you're going to run. So that would be acceptance or functional or unit. And then optionally again, which specific test you're going to run if you only want to run one test out of your suite. So that's kind of the basic background to it. But often people say, you know, what do I need tests for? Well, if that's you, leave the room now. You're in the wrong talk. Essentially, testing has become accepted over the last probably 5 to 7 years as something that most of us do more of the time than we don't. And I'd go with that as well. So if you already use PHP unit, why switch? Well, hopefully through the demo you'll see a number of reasons to do that, but essentially it allows you to test much more easily than with PHP unit on its own the other elements in the stack. So at acceptance level, people who try and do acceptance level testing with PHP unit and something like Selenium on its own are actually people who enjoy pain, in my experience. So if you're already a Behat user, who uses Behat in the room? Okay, a few of you. So why would you only want to write things once, like you would in Codeception? Behat forces you to write things twice. You have a textual description and then you go and write your test to pass the textual acceptance criteria. In Codeception, generally it's all in the same file. Now I think Behat works very well if you're in large teams and you have people with distinct roles. So you have people who are project managers or business analysts who would write the acceptance criteria but would never write the code to pass that. So if you as a programmer get handed those files and said make that set of tests to support this scenario, I think that's fine. But the majority of people I've met in the PHP world don't work in such large teams. They work in much smaller teams. They're often wearing multiple hats themselves, so they're often an analyst programmer, and therefore why make life hard for yourself? Already talked about Selenium. It's a bit too flaky on its own for my liking. XPath is very good at identifying individual items on a page, but it's also subject to every time you make a change on the page, you might have to update your tests. And then the other thing, some people have said to me, what's all this guy stuff about? Well, it's just, you know, it was either guys or gals, and he felt he'd get less hassle from calling them guys. So I am a guy, I do things, is the basic premise. So how do you install this then as a set of software? Basically, it's recommended to download the FAR file. It's a single download. It's actually got PHP unit bundled inside it. It's got Mink drivers bundled inside it. The only other thing you would need on top of that is probably Selenium and perhaps something like Phantom.js, or if you want to use Chrome as your browser, a thing called Chrome driver. But there's some notes in a bit.ly bundle at the end of the slides that will direct you to some more notes about that. So essentially you grab it, wget, download it by your browser, whichever, and then when you're running Codeception, you issue PHP codecept.far and then the command you want to run. Similarly, you can do very similar with Composer. So you install Composer as you would normally, and then you add Codeception to your composer.json file in the root of your project, and then you update your Composer, and it will pull the file down. And then inside your vendor bin folder, you'll find a Codecept binary that can just be run thereafter in the same fashion. Okay, so we've looked at the kind of basics there, and if we now move on and just look at some of the advanced features, other things you can have are helpers to add your own actions on top of what Codeception provides you. You can group tests together. So some of the projects we work on have, several hundred tests involved in them. And even though you can group them into acceptance or functional layers, you perhaps want to subgroup them. And rather than having a large directory structure and making it more awkward that way, you can just pass a group name in. And so you could say, run the group that deals with user login, and it would just run all the tests around that group for you. There's an interactive console that you can use on the command line. And that allows you to basically have instructions to Codeception run immediately. So if you're trying to identify a selector on screen and it's not getting the right one, you can go into the console and you can try variations until you get the right one, and it basically evals that against the framework. You can reconfigure configuration on the fly. So if you've got large suites, you can switch things to be run on different browsers, for example. They are working on that a little more so that you can actually run tests against multiple different destinations. So you could run it in Firefox and in Chrome at the same time, for example, or Safari or something like that. We mentioned briefly stubs. If you're wanting to mock things out, you can get into all of that. More advanced things. I will, if there's time, show some elements to do with a couple of these. Page objects is basically a design pattern that's used in a lot of testing frameworks to describe the UI map. So that would be your URLs, your selectors for the screen. So it abstracts them away from your tests so that you're not repeating the same CSS selectors in multiple tests and things. So that's quite useful. Events is a fairly recent thing inside Codeception. So you'll get kind of before test, after test things that are running that you can then hook into with your own extensions and group classes. Conditional asserts also, sometimes optional things can happen and you don't want your test suite to fail, but it's nice to see whether it was there or not. So there's a number of see methods, so I can see on screen or I can see in a database, for example, and there's a can see equivalent which doesn't stop the test. It will just report that it was a failure at the end. And also comments. You can put a lot of comments in the tests just in a very shorthand form there with the $I and kind of the PHP 5 array notation, really. Okay, so there's a number of resources, and it's just to point you to the best thing to do is download the slides after. The one that's crossed out there, Ghost Driver, used to be required to work with Phantom.js to do headless testing, but that's now bundled straight into Phantom.js in more recent versions, so it's not needed anymore. So let's move on to testing. There's more details of me. The element in yellow there is where you can go and download the slides and a number of notes about this. And at the end, I'd appreciate if you could go and fill in the joined in feedback there. So I'm now going to switch, go to mirrored mode on the laptop so I can do a demo for you. Whilst I'm doing that, if there's any questions at this stage, feel free. Go on.
All right. You talked about the groups. Is it possible to have groups across functional and unit tests, for example?
Yes, it does work.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Yeah, so you can group things logically rather than hierarchically in terms of folder structure. Okay, right, you're seeing what I'm seeing, which is good. Okay, there's a number of web pages we're going to use. We're going to use the BBC. Hopefully this will work live over the internet. Failing that, I've also got local things that we can do that are just from NetBeans editor. There's some standard sample projects you can have, so they're available in any instance of NetBeans. There's a to-do list app and a kind of rent-a-flat app. So we'll look at those. I'm going to start with the BBC. So you can see there that I'm issuing php codecept.far run. It's the acceptance level that I'm wanting to test. And I'm actually going to just call bbc sept.php. The sept and there's a sest format as well. It's just a naming convention pulled from Codeception. You know, it's like it could do with some better naming, this project, basically, in my opinion. And then the -c flag is just telling it where the root of this Codeception run is going to be from. I'm a meta level up in directory structure. So that's going to start. You'll see it's fired Chrome up already. This is look no hands, you know. It's actually driving to the BBC. I hope you're not all downloading things at the same time as I am, but it will get there. There you go. It's gone to the BBC homepage. It is now checking for a particular string of text on the homepage, and as soon as that kind of loads up, it'll close down the browser session, and it should all disappear. There you go. Oh no, this is going to the weather section. So once it rendered the page, it's then clicked on the weather link, and there you go. So as you can see here, what was running in the background in the console was the actual test element. So it's saying to you, I'm trying to check the BBC homepage is up. Well, I think that worked. The scenario is I'm on page / and I see some text. The BBC is not responsible for the context of external sites. I had to change this morning. My test used to check for the sign-in link, which only works from the UK. Apparently you guys in the continent here don't get that. You know, and also, when I was here, I set this up to test against bbc.co.uk, and then it took me a little while to work out it switched to .com. So I've altered my test to go straight for .com because it saved a few DNS lookups and things to make the run ever so slightly faster. And then, so having found the text on the home page, it's then said I click on weather, and I see weather in the context of an H1. Okay, so I'm now going to show you in NetBeans that isn't even running. There you go, let's load that up. The actual Codeception test for that. Just wait for that to load. So the actual code for that is very straightforward. And it's basically, you instantiate a new web guy. You always pass in the scenario. That's just provided by the framework for you as a pre-known variable set, object, sorry. And I want to, so this is introducing the first BDD style action. So I want to do something. It's a description action rather than it doing anything. So I want to check the BBC homepage is up. And if you remember in the console, that kind of came out in a funny kind of shade of pink there. Could be purple. I'm colourblind. I don't really care. So I am on page /. Well, how does it know that it's the BBC that it's trying to go to? Well, this is where the YAML files come in. And basically, inside the acceptance test, in the test suite, there's a very simple YAML file, which we'll just walk through now. Basically, you've got a modules section, so you're enabling modules, and and we've used Web Helper, which is just a generic helper module, and Selenium 2. So we jump down to the config here. I've specified the URL. I've said it's localhost. I've said it's Chrome, and it's running something on port quad 4 there. So that might interest you to know what's running on that port. And I've got a 1 second delay in there. So should we see what's running on that port? Anybody who's used Selenium before will know it's actually Selenium. So here's a bunch of output from Selenium. To me, it's not really interesting unless I'm actually debugging something quite low level. And basically, that's just a Java app. You run it. I'll just cat my little script there. Java -jar and straight to your downloaded archive for Selenium. So that's very easy to set up. So I'll just set that running again. Whilst that's loading up, if I try and rerun the same test, you'll get a failure because the Selenium's not running. So if you kind of see these red things, it's kind of something major's not working, something's not running in the rest of your infrastructure. So you perhaps need to sort that out first. Once Selenium kind of gets to the point that it's loaded up and it says listening on port 4444, then you're good to go. And obviously that can take a little while to start up each time. So I tend to leave that session running in the background. If you use NetBeans as an IDE, there's actually a Selenium module for that, a plugin that allows you to kind of have it running every time you open NetBeans. And that will just take over that port and always be available. It won't necessarily be the latest version. It's obviously what's tied to the NetBeans releases. So there you go. That's actually running now. We could now relaunch that script. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to comment out that delay. So this will be full speed, okay? Bearing in mind that acceptance tests are the slowest form of these. But given what it's doing, it's firing a browser up, going over a network, actually clicking things, downloading content, etc. It's mostly the network infrastructure you're waiting for rather than the testing framework. On a 1 second, you won't see much delay. But for example, we're using this in production usage, which is really bizarre for a testing framework, to go and log in to a site that we can't get an API for, that we can't get a feed for, to go in, set a bunch of elements inside their preferences to then go and be able to download an XML file. And we've automated that, and we just run that with a nice big delay, kind of a 20-second delay on everything, on one core section when it goes and downloads it, because it was very simple and easy to do. And we now take those XML files, for about 35 XML files, and convert them, put them in a database, and all the good things that you would do with that. So there you go. It ran, and it took 36 seconds. Okay, so yes, it can be used for nefarious activity like web scraping as well, should you so wish. If you want to use Firefox, Firefox works immediately kind of out of the box. You don't need any extra drivers. All you do is switch Chrome for Firefox, and off you go. I'm now going to do the same test with Phantom.js. Now, Phantom.js is a headless browser, and that basically means you get all the elements of a browser, it just doesn't render the windows, okay? So this time you won't see a browser pop up and do all its goodness, but you watch. So once for me, the workflow is that you test it in a real browser, actually see that happening, and switch out for headless that you might run in your continuous integration environment. Because if you know that the selectors are all correct and that you can see all that, you don't need to wait for it to kind of prove that work. So that's kind of 6 seconds. Running headless, okay? So much better for a continuous integration environment. You're not waiting for literally images to kind of download and all that. It's all happening in the background. Because you're not rendering it to screen, it's just a lot faster. Okay, let's get back over here. Next then, we're going to look at the To-Do app. Now this To-Do app is very straightforward. Basically, it's a list of to-dos. You can see some pending items. So there's a few items in there. dones, etc. And then there's this add section which allows you to add things. But I've picked it as an application because it's got a few little things like the DOM gets adjusted. So when I click on the date there, it renders that kind of calendar widget. That's not visible to begin with. So that can give you a few issues if you're not careful. Because the thing behind Codeception is that it's actually as rendered. So if you have, for example, CSS that makes things uppercase, you have to search for the uppercase, not the output that came over the wire. It's actually the rendered version. So post CSS, post JavaScript, that's what it's looking for. Now that's quite powerful so long as you know about it up front. Okay, so let's just have a look in the test folder there. So if we do php codecept.far, run, acceptance. I'm just going to do the pending to-dos first. Okay, now this is going to fire Chrome up again. Oops, get the right version. It's no delay on, I'm trying to make it relatively straightforward. Now, this is a failure, this is intended, this is part of the talk. Before you think anything else, it's just to show you what a failure looks like. So if we scroll back a little bit, you can see that it's going through the steps, and basically you get this nice failed notification. You can probably see already, I've just put a 0 in instead of an O, pending to do zeros or something. It was just to force an error. And then it says, I couldn't see my pending to-dos. Now, in the I want to layer that we probably have over here, pending to-dos. This is the actual test. So I want to see my pending to-dos. Now, Codeception is relatively clever in that it fails. It says, I couldn't see my pending to-dos. So long as you cooperate with the framework, you actually get readable output. And then it gives you some of the output, the textual version of the output, and reverses the steps so you can see how far it got, and at the bottom of your run, the failed thing is usually visible. So we shall correct that and switch that for an O, resave, and rerun. And this should just kind of go straight through this time. And it's almost incidental that there's a browser there, really. It's that we want to check. So it passed this time, took a few seconds. Yay! So there you go. The next one I'll look at is the add pending to do. So that's the one with the calendar widget. It's a little more complex as a test, but as you can see there, it's still the same thing. The BDD scenarios at the top there. So I am a to-do list user. I want to add a pending to-do, and I look forward to seeing test to-do added to the database. Database, front-end testing. Here we go. It introduces a new concept here, the locator. This is a kind of helper class that's available inside Codeception. So if you have things that are a bit more complex in terms of CSS selectors than just an ID or a class, you can kind of make it do that. So this time we're looking for an input tag with a name of to-do due on date. Okay, so it saves you having to work out what that would actually be in terms of XPath and that sort of thing. And then down here, having clicked a few items and put some things in, it's got a check for I see in database. Now, in our Codeception, in our YAML file for this, there's a kind of master YAML file here. There's a DSN set up so that you can actually talk to a database. If we now run that one, and it's called add pending. Oops, I can't spell. Add pending to do singular. There we go. This is firing up. And it clicks the add to do in the bottom left, and now it starts filling things in, picks the date and so on. It changes the priority, puts a description in. Again, look, no hands, this is magic. And it saved it, and it saw to do save successfully. That's a little gotcha on that one, because in the acceptance suite, If you don't have a delay on this, so if you have too big a delay, if you put a 3-second delay in, for example, because that's a thing that disappears, it's only a transient notification, it's there, it's disappeared before the check runs. So you've got to keep your timings under control, shall we say. So that passed, and it actually showed us what was there in the database. So if you look at the IC in database there, it's given us a kind of JSON representation of what it saw in the database. So we've provided the test scenarios and the elements in a table in the database to check it was there. So if you relook at the actual element, I've specified the to-do table and just an array enough to make it a unique row. And the advantage here is that you can have an SQL dump that's set up, and I know in this scenario it's got 9 existing entries. So I could add an entry 10, for example, and it would just be there, and I could check for the ID 10 because I knew I was always setting the scenario up. That's quite powerful. How are we doing for time? 5 minutes. Okay. I have far more to demo on this than is possible in the time, so that's also okay. What I will do is just run one of the renter flat kind of scenarios. So just to show you the other project, really. Now this is showing some things at functional level. So let me just have a look at test acceptance. Yes, if I do PHP code accept.far, okay, so this is basically showing you in a browser at the acceptance level one that I'm going to run functionally in a moment. So it goes in, fills all these elements in on the page. Interestingly, again, if we just, whilst this is playing out, if we look at things that are from the perspective of it has to be seen, if it's below the fold, you'll get an error, which is that the element might exist, but it's not visible because it's out of sight. So you have to be able to focus or scroll and things like that. So all those things are available. So it's there, it's done it, it's filled all the pieces in, and it's shown you the database element. So I'm going to run the same thing now, but from a functional point of view. If you note on screen at the moment, that had 31 seconds runtime. That was functional. So that's actually firing up. This is a Zen Framework project, fired up Zen Framework, did exactly the same steps, but from an emulated level rather than a real browser, and it took, well, you know, half a second, which I think is pretty cool.
So does it instance a new instance of the Zen Framework and run the
request and response objects, basically? And it pretty much does that for all the current frameworks. So obviously doing that, I mean, you know, from ZF2, you can get oddities if it's not, if it's relying on environmental elements like Apache things. So as long as you're sensible about it, it's pretty good. But yeah, I'm just going to run that again for effect because, 480, awesome. So under half a second there. So if you're setting this up and you've got thousands of tests, obviously you don't want them running at 30 seconds a piece because you'll be there all night. Even in a continuous integration environment, it's good to move a lot of stuff to functional. If possible. As I say, I've so much more I could demo. One of the things I will just show is the BBC News stuff again. This navigate to news technology is an extension I've created. It's a step element, which was from the advanced section. The step is simply there. We extend the web guy with news steps. I navigate to the news home, and so on. I've abstracted out the URLs into a page helper. The page helper is very simple, constants for URLs, public static for selectors. And you can do, there's other little things like a route helper and things like that. Again, this broke on me this morning because the European version of the BBC site, if you navigate to news, it says tech. In the UK, it says technology. Yeah, I was looking for technology and it failed. If we pop D out of there and Okay, this is going to fire up the BBC again, and we should get a failure. Oh, this will fail as well. IC sign in. It doesn't exist, not on that version. So in the step there, I would switch out the sign in for the other string that it's a legal thing. It's always going to be there. And just for speed, I'll comment that one out and put the tech one back in and leave that one running. Any other questions then?
The acceptance test of the add to-do list, you had a IC in database.
Yes.
Is that something you should do in an acceptance test? Compare it to being a manager. A manager doesn't know what a database is. He wants to see stuff on screen.
Yes, I'm not expecting the manager to go and write that, but they might write the BDD scenario at the top. You know, I am a user, I want to see this, I want to see the result. You would then fill in the nuts and bolts talking to a database and things like that. So for me, it's about the whole loop. So if I've added a record, I check it's there. Now I might check it's there by navigating to another page and seeing it's in the list. That would be perfectly acceptable, but I think as a shortcut, it's really good to be able to just see that the database record actually landed, because then I'm actually dealing with one thing. I'm not dealing with, did the list page work as well? I'm actually dealing with, did the add scenario work? Yes, it did. It was in the database. So it's isolating your tests.
Functional tests are faster than acceptance tests, but if you have a lot of functional tests, still the suite takes a lot of time. Can Codeception run tests in parallel?
It's not something that's there currently. It's basically built using PHP, so it would be quite hard to implement that as it stands currently. You know, set it up in your continuous integration environment. When you commit or whatever, it will run them, and it doesn't really matter how long it takes to run then. If you have a large suite, obviously when you're developing, you're kind of doing it in a kind of workflow iteration. But, you know, half a second for a functional test, it's not that bad. Okay.
If in an acceptance test, you can also validate some JavaScript, I assume?
You can validate the effects of the JavaScript. So if it manipulates the DOM, yes, or if it returns things from Ajax, you can look at the returned response to the JSON object, for example, or whatever.
Okay, how will they handle the functional test then? Because the functional test doesn't execute the JavaScript.
No, so you have to pick what tests are appropriate for your scenario. It can emulate JavaScript, so it will make the request, and because it's an object, it should get a response. Or you could mock it out. That's the.
But you should write different tests for different. You can't use the same test for both functional and acceptance.
They have to be slightly different. If I just show you the where's it gone? The add new offer one, which was in the flat. This version is the acceptance test, and it's doing the C in database and checking that the URL is correct. It's submitted the form. This version is the functional test. Same sort of thing you could be done there, but I was actually showing another style, which is I submit form. It's another action. Same sort of thing, and I C in database. So you could copy and paste, and in fact, that's how I do it if I'm developing. And I want to move things from acceptance level to functional level. I'll check it in an acceptance level first, check it works in the browser, move it into the functional layer, adjust anything that needs it, and off you go. Okay. I'm a visual person. I like to see the browser doing things. So I've confirmed it's the correct selectors and so on. There's another question just behind. Yeah.
Can you usually test when things are, if you have to be authenticated for something, and can you mock out third-party stuff, like other services where you need to interact with?
Yes, the question was, can you mock out kind of having to log in and things like that and so on. You can make that part of your test, just stick a username and password in, and it will log in, literally log in. You could mock out OAuth and things like that, or you could actually sign up for real. Why the hell not? You know, you can really test it. One of the things you can do, the page objects allow you to, the steps allow you to extend WebGuy. And if you look at the BBC News one, the first thing I've done is the whole navigate to the technology section is just abstracted away. So you could do that with the login. So if your app has to be logged in for pretty much every step other than sign up, you would just put that away in a helper. But the advantage is, as you run the test, it still runs every single step and you see every single step, including the login step and all of that. It's just not in your code. It makes the test really nice and short, but it's doing 5, 10, 15, 20 steps, and you see them all in the output. So if something failed during login, you would see it in the failed test output still. So that's quite useful. One more then, perhaps.
Would it be possible, if you use this in combination with a committer to run it automatically, to send out a report to a designer with screenshots?
Yes, reports. Glad you reminded me. In the reports, in the test folder, there's log output, there's a report there. There you go, you can see the report. It's got elements and so on. The red if they failed, obviously, and so on. So it's quite useful to actually see how that's going. If we look at the to-do list one, for example, in the test folder in log, you can move all the locations of these things as well. It's just the here by default. There you can see all the tests that we're running, see all the steps. So again, that's quite useful for managers.
Is it possible to add a screenshot of each step?
Yes. In fact, one of the tests that we had today has a make a screenshot option. It's probably in this one. No. One of them has make a screenshot. It's definitely there as an action, and it basically takes a PNG snapshot. Also, it can take PNG snapshots on failures. So if you're running headless mode in Phantom.js or Zombie.js and a step fails, it can also just automatically take a PNG of the failure. So even though it's not a browser window that you're seeing, it takes a snapshot because it's emulating and it's using WebKit and things as backend, so it can do everything that can do. So that's, again, really useful for when you're actually debugging, that it's got a PNG. Obviously, then you have to script the environment to take things out and publish them if you want them someplace else inside your continuous integration, email it or whatever you need to do to say, here's the failure, and it'll take the screenshot of what the problem was. Pretty powerful stuff, really. Are we okay?
Yes, you're running out of time.
Okay, thank you very much.